Hi rockers and rollers, here's Simon at Rough Guitars with another installment of my DIY guitar video series. In this episode we're going to be talking about electrics, and this is going to be part one of two electric parts. In this first part we're going to wire the potentiometers together, we're going to wire the three-way switch, and we're also going to wire the output jack. In the second part we build these into the guitar and connect them all together. You're going to need a few tools for this, we'll get into that a little bit later. You're also going to need patience, and you're going to need a steady hand. Soldering work is not easy. Let's just get that out front. It takes practice. People go to school to learn how to do this, but I always say if I can do it, then so can you. Just take your time. Perhaps the first couple of times aren't going to be so good, but practice makes perfect. And also you're just following a very easy, simple diagram, yeah? So if you can follow instructions step for step, like building a Lego set or something like that, then you can do this sort of work as well. It's not so complicated, it's just fiddly. So without any further ado, one thing, before anybody writes me horrible mails or comments, the state of the pots in this, these are old practice pots of mine that I've had lying around at home here. This is a project guitar for my sister, so it's certainly not commercially for sale or something like this. I would never use components that look like this in a customer's guitar. So like I say, these are old pots, they work perfectly well, but as you can see from the mess on the top of them, they've been in and out a few guitars over the years. So with that aside, let's just get into it and wire this thing together. Here's a set of the tools you're going to need. First, here's a third hand with a magnifying glass. And then we've got a soldering station with a variable temperature. It's a good thing to have. We've got an old wet sponge to clean the tip of the soldering iron. We have some flux core solder there. And this here is a syringe for cleaning up solder messes. Very important for me. And there we have wire strippers, and over here wire cutters and long nose pliers, and a digital multimeter. Here we have a template that I've built that you can wire the pots together without having to do it inside the cavity of the guitar. It's very handy. And here we have a wiring diagram, like a schematic that you can follow point for point. These are available online. And here's the hardware that we're going to need. We have a set of iron gear humbucker pickups, and here we have our potentiometers. They're 500k CTS pots. The tone pots themselves are push-pull pots for coil splitting. 0.022 microfarad capacitors, a three-way switch, and a 1/4 inch guitar output jack. You'll also need assorted wires. I've got some cloth braided wire here, and I've also got some old shielded cable that I got out of an old computer monitor. It's very good stuff. So down to the nuts and bolts. The first thing we're going to do is attach the capacitor to the tone pots. We're going to tuck it just in beneath that plastic lip there, like that. You want to bend the wires on the cap so they look something like this. It's going to make it fit nice and tight. And solder them on. One wire goes to the ground onto the metal side of the pot. The other wire goes to lug number 3. And snip off your excess wire there. And all goes to plan. It should look something like this. One wire onto the side of the pot, one wire onto lug number 3. Now for the switch's ground wire. The ground wire from the switch goes from solder point number 1 round the side of the pot and onto the ground with the other wire from the capacitor. So strip the end of the wire. One end is soldered into port number 1 and the other end soldered together with the ground wire from the capacitor. And it shall look like this. You do exactly the same thing with the other tone pot. So now onto the volume pots. The first thing you need to do is ground lug number 3. So you bend that round with your long nose pliers till it's touching the casing, and then solder it in place. So there's the volume pot grounded, it's lug number 3 onto the casing. And now you can fit your pots onto your template board. Neck volume, neck tone, bridge volume, bridge tone. And so next is the little hot wire that runs in between the tone and the volume pots. We're going to be using red wire for the bridge and green wire for the neck, and it goes from the middle lug, lug number 2 in the tone, to lug number 1 in the volume. Strip your wires down and then you end up with this. So always tin all your wires. Tinning refers to just melting a piece of solder onto the end of the wire before you attach it onto the pots. This makes for just a much cleaner and better join. So before you solder the wires, just make a little bit of a hook with the end of it and attach it into the hole in the lug and squeeze it tight with a pair of pliers. What this does is just makes a good mechanical connection even before you put the solder on it, just so that it stays in place better. And solder them into place. Good thing to remember when you're soldering is to not actually melt the solder onto the metal. You should be heating up the part that's going to be soldered and then just melting the solder onto the part itself, not onto the tip of the soldering iron. So we've got our wires going from lug number 1 of the volume to lug number 2 in the tone, and now we're going to make the ground loop. So I know it's not technically a loop, that's not an electrical term, but I mean it's a set of wires that goes from the grounding points from each pot and connects them all together. So I'm using this braided cloth wire as my ground wire, so I can just push back the cloth there, get a little bit of wire sticking out, and then I'm going to twist them together. So when you do this 4 times, you're going to have a continual circle of wire with 4 points sticking out. And then I'm going to tin these points. And then you're going to solder the wire onto the casings of the ground point of each pot. So this stage is complete. We've got the caps, we've got the switch grounds, we've got the hot wires, and we've got the potentiometer grounds themselves. All finished so far. Now it's time for the 3-way switch and the output jack. Tin your wires. Always tin your wires. Like with the hot points on your pots, the way to tin is you heat the wire up first and then just lay the solder down onto the wire and let it melt into it, so that it looks something like that. Here I've got the cables for my switch measured and laid out. I've got the cloth cable for the ground, and I've got the computer monitor cable that I recycled for the live. First up, bend the 2 middle lugs together so they're touching. I'm going to stick a bit of solder into the holes first. And we're going to solder the cables on now. Like I said before, I've got green for the neck position and red for the bridge position. And so, of course, the green goes on the switch up side. Make sure you get that properly worked out before you start soldering them up, which way is up and down. So the 2 hot wires are on. And now the ground goes onto the single one in the back. And then we have our blue output wire. This one is going to be running down to the output jack, and this goes into the middle 2 lugs. We're going to wrap it up in tape now to keep the solder points nice and stable. So wrap them up good so they stay in place. I'm also going to wrap the end of the cables up in tape as well. This is for ease of operation later as I'm threading it through the cable slot in the guitar. And so lastly here we just need to attach the ground to the guitar jack. This output jack is a mono jack. It only has 2 lugs, one for the ground and one for the hot. And the hot one is always in the middle of the sandwich. That's how I remember it anyway. And that, boys and girls, is as far as we can go without building the hardware into the guitar itself. So we've got our pots in a harness, we've got the 3-way switch done, and we've got the output jack with the ground. Like, subscribe, leave a comment.